Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on KPI selection and management. Our presenter today is Tom Raftery, and I will be handing over to him in just a moment. But before I do that, I think I've got a little problem with my sound which I need to fix. So just give me a second to do that, please. It seems to be... mic testing. Is that okay? Can I just get a response from you, please, in the chat box, if you can hear me all right? Great, thank you very much, Sammy. Thank you. Okay, so just after that little interruption, I just want to run you through a few housekeeping points so that the afternoon goes smoothly. The slides and the recording of the webinar will be available on our SlideShare page, as well as on our YouTube channel, and we will send you a link to this in a post-webinar. At the end of the webinar, a survey will pop up, and I just ask that you give time to this to give us feedback on how we've done and what we could improve on. I think the sound might still be very good, so if you want to let us know if we need to fix anything, please do now, before Tom actually starts talking. As you're listening to Tom, you might have some questions, and if you would like to leave out or type them into the question box, which is on the bottom right of the control panel, this is where you can engage with us, and right at the end, we'll spend a few moments to answer these. So thank you very much for being here, and enjoy the webinar. Thank you, Tom.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to sunny Dubai, which I'm sure some of you may be in the region or not. Okay, the session today, well, a little bit about me first and foremost. I'm I've been in the operational roles, mainly around the area of HR and management. And a lot of my work has been involved in sort of objectives and KPIs, because I first worked with the balance scorecard, which I'll talk about later, in the 90s in the group in Jeddah. We were certainly the first company in the Middle East to do it, and we were amongst the first globally, because the CEO of the NASA Group had connections with Harvard and had met Norman and Kaplan, and I was really lucky to experience going through the balance scorecard in the mid-90s. Done a lot of work in that area then, introducing the balance scorecard in various companies that I've been in. And so I've got a lot of experience, and part of my role here is to outline to you how you use KPIs and how you select them and measure them. So I'll be taking you through a couple of slides, and we're going to have a few polls, because I really wanted to know what sort of people will be listening to this. Of the people we have so far who voted, half of you voted, and 50% show your operational managers and 50% of your employees. So operational managers, you want to show that you're getting good KPIs and managing them effectively. And for employees, you want to make sure you have the right KPIs assigned to you so you can meet those targets. So hopefully we'll go through this. KPIs is really about performance, and it's about measurement. They're the two things that really summarize KPIs. And for me, it's absolutely critical that everyone should be working to objectives and KPIs to make sure you're delivering the business and more delivering what you want to achieve. So the critical reason is companies that use measurement to manage their business are far more successful than those that don't. The American Management Association outlined that 74% of those who have a measurement managed organization were perceived as industry leaders. 83% reported financially ranked in the top third in the industry, whilst any of these companies going through major cultural and organization change were a lot more successful. And as we know, many projects and major change projects fail because they're not managed effectively. So selecting and managing KPIs is critical for the future. Just want to quickly go through some points here, why we measure performance. And I think sorry, I've jumped too far. It's ultimately is about linking strategy to implementation. And what I try to do with people here is create an audit trail so that you can see the strategic objectives, you can see the strategic KPIs, and you can see how that then is able to define divisional objectives, KPIs, department, section, and down to individual. The way I refer to it is it's a bit like a pyramid. We build strategy and objectives from the top. Do we always communicate it down? That is an issue. But the way to test it is once you've got all your strategic, divisional, department, individual objectives and KPIs, you should be able to build them back up so you build the pyramid from the bottom. If you do that, you'll be able to deliver what the business wants. You effective decision making. You know where your money's been invested and the right resources are being placed to achieve the performance, and that ultimately that you're going to develop your strategy and systems. And that can be linked to objectives, KPIs, targets, and incentives. So setting and managing KPIs, very interesting work carried by M. Brown of Keeping Store, a very interesting book. Talks about really the fewer the better. Biggest things we see, or I see working with companies, too many objectives, too many KPIs, because it's your comfort zone. You want to have something that you can easily hit. Is there an audit trail? Can you link that department objectives back up to divisional objectives or corporate objectives? Is there what I call an audit trail? You need to be doing that. Are they going to drive what you need, what the customer, shareholders, and stakeholders need? Okay, you should start at the top and flow down, but you should be able to see it flowing back up in terms of delivering what the company needs. To use multiple indexes, often people try to measure too many things. When you look at an objective or KPI, there's often 2 or 3 measures within that. Keep it simple. Work on one single index. They may need to be changed, obviously, if there's certain circumstances with the environment or the strategy changes, you'll need to change those as well. And the targets must be based on research. So do you have measures from the past or data from the past that you can measure, that you'll be able to see whether you're actually delivering the key performance indicators? So that's critically important, rather than just pulling figures out of the air and hoping that you achieve them. So moving on, we've got to look at, and I love this quote. In fact, I'm a big fan of the balanced scorecard, and that quote from Kaplan really says a lot of employees don't understand where the business is going. They don't understand, they're not engaged, they don't see what role they have to play. And this really stems from the very top, and it flows right down the organization. I'd like to ask a poll at the moment. So just we've got a couple of polls here before I move on. One of these is about, do you have smart objectives and KPIs? Have we got that right one? No. Okay. No, who is responsible? That's right. Who's responsible for? Have we got that correct? Just bear with us for a second. We've lost the poll. Okay, we're just having a bit of a technical issue over in the polls. What we want to do, who is responsible for driving objectives and KPIs within your organization? Because in my experience, it's not always who you think it should be doing. A lot of it is people tend to drive it themselves. So that was the nature of the poll, but we seem to be struggling with it at the moment. Are we there? Okay. What we'll probably do then is, should we just move on if that's not there? Yeah, sorry, we've had a technical issue with the poll. It's there, I can see it, but obviously you can't. Okay, if anyone can see that poll, can they tell us? No? Okay. No. We thought we'd be pretty smart here and add some polls to it. Let's go back to the presentation. At least the first one worked, but we weren't able to get the others. So obviously you can't answer that question, but I think a lot of it is down to who's responsible for doing that. And it's actually at all levels, at strategic level with the senior management, at divisional department level with that managers, and then down to individual managers working on their employees' objectives and KPIs. So there needs to be that flow. So just moving on, I think I want to put the context, obviously, as most of us I think are in the region. What is performance measurement like here? And I think one of the things I've found, both working here as I have done for many years and working as a consultant and trainer, there's not really consistent in developing an application. You know, and one thing I find managers just like doing, they don't like planning and all the rest. They just want to be seen to be doing things. And the culture of performance measurement is not there. In some organizations, it's very strong. I was talking to one of the leading companies in the region. There's some companies here doing a hell of a lot in performance measurement. We also see a lot of companies doing very little. They often don't have experience in establishing objectives and KPIs, and I'm amazed how difficult they find defining objectives and KPIs, because therefore they often become quite vague. And then there's little follow-up, either weekly or monthly meetings. I know people who say we've got objectives and KPIs, but they only review them every quarter. If you're really going to use performance measurement to manage your business and use objectives and KPIs, then you need to be at the very least doing it monthly. And often people use them as a check rather than manage the business. You know, how are we doing against this KPI? Are we achieving it? And what do we need to do when we're not achieving it? Moving on from that, it's not stop scrolling. Okay, sorry about this. Okay, we've moved on to the next one. What we also need to be doing is looking at why is there so much problems with performance measurement in the region, and in part, I believe it's often down to the management style. We tend to have an authoritarian leadership style. We're quite centralized and bureaucratic organizations. Decision making is invariably slow. And performance evaluation is always a very emotive topic, particularly when it gets down to individual levels in terms of lack of objectivity and lack of measurement. And obviously, relationships is more important rather than performance. And I think that's why performance measurement and using objectives and KPIs are absolutely critical to help address some of these issues. Classically, you've got to look at Drucker's statement. You know, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's a true statement, and I think all of you will nod your heads as in agreement, say yes. But ultimately, do you have clear objectives and clear KPIs in order to measure that you're achieving those objectives? The answer is probably no. So what are various schemes and processes out there that, if we go back to the 70s, the old management by objectives, which still applies now, is a typical method. Review what the organization is, set the objectives, monitor, evaluate, and reward. It's a simple process, and a lot of people are still using that, and it still has value in that process. There's some people may be using the TQM model, very much looking at the customer, identifying what changes you need to the process, managing that, looking for the continual improvements, and making sure that's fed back to the customer. The plan, do, check, act cycle is another similar one as well. And more recently, over the last decade or two, is the Six Sigma, developed by Motorola, far more detailed, very much linked into lean processes, quality systems, and the various process for how they control, change, define it, measure it, and analyze it. Again, look at the element of that. It's about measurement. You can't really understand how well you're doing until you actively measure that, and that's where KPIs come in. Then, not finally, but the main one that a lot of people know about is the balanced scorecard, developed by Norton and Kaplan in the mid-90s. That's in fact when I was doing it with the NASA group. And I love the quote that they made. They said, presently companies drive the business mainly through the financials. It's a bit like driving a car looking through the rearview mirror, because financials are lag indicators. And their view was, you know, if you look after the customer, you get the measures and performance around the customers, about the learning and growth, and about your business processes. If you get those three right, the financials will follow. I think any finance director will be very brave if they agree with that, but I still think that And certainly in my experience, if you look at the balance of those performance objectives and measures, and this is where key performance indicators came from the work of Kaplan and Norton, you will certainly go a long way in terms of achieving your objectives. I think we've got to look at this as why we do it, put it within the performance management cycle. It's an integrated, continuous cycle rather than a one-time event. And it's often seen as a one-time event. We do our performance appraisal every year, so let's set our strategic objectives, blah, blah, blah. That's all good and well, but it needs to change. If you want a culture of performance management, it's about continual monitoring, people taking responsibility and authority and accountability for that, and making sure that people have aligned objectives and KPIs, they have their names against them, and they manage and monitor that all the way through. And then obviously this needs to be linked in to an infrastructure where you can align people, process, and technology, and ultimately everyone's focused on delivering the strategy, and that's ultimately the aim. So you've got to understand that in terms of performance management. And I think if you look again, I use this analogy of a pyramid. Typically you could have this as a strategy map, vision, mission, with the market differentiators and strategic goals or objectives, and then that will filter down to department objectives and KPIs. And you can see that's a bit like a pyramid, and even from the department objectives and KPIs, you then should be able to develop individual objectives and KPIs. So for me, it's about putting all those little blocks together of individual KPIs, objectives, department objectives, KPIs, etc., to build it back up to a pyramid. Then you know you've got something solid that will be able to help to drive performance. And ultimately, if people can see what they're doing in terms of achieving their KPIs and objectives is going to contribute to the business, you're certainly going to have people more dedicated and focused on what they do. So typically, again, we have a performance management cycle. I just want to take you through this. The strategy is very much what do we want to achieve, and that's often highlighted at the top level. And increasingly, I do work with many companies on helping them with KPIs in their selection and management. And what we see is the strategy that's established at the top, they're not clear about it because it hasn't been communicated. It's held at that top level. So when we work with the senior managers, middle managers, they often have to develop what they believe the strategy is. To me, that's not right. Why keep it at the top and not communicate it down the organization? That's absolutely critical. It needs to be transparent. And I still see this is where the authoritarian point comes. I've got the information, information's power, I'll keep it to myself. And I can see and sense in many organizations a degree of frustration with that. But ultimately, once you've got what we want to achieve, how do we set the direction? What do we need to be doing in terms of objectives, and therefore, how do we need to be measuring ourselves to do that, to achieve it? And the reason you have the measures, particularly the KPIs, what do we know, what can we measure to make sure we deliver it? And more importantly, what's impacting us as we go along? So what are the potential barriers, and how can we be proactive in dealing with the barriers rather than suddenly meeting on a 1st of March and saying we're doing our quarterly review and we're way behind on this particular measure and it's due to be delivered this month. Should be no surprises. Then we look at how you monitor and evaluate that, and that's very much how our progress, and that's where you need to be doing it, certainly on a monthly basis, if not weekly. And then ultimately, because you're building objectives and KPIs all the way through, how does that flow down to individuals, to you, to me, in terms of our objectives, our personal KPIs in terms of what we want to achieve, and how is that going to encourage the right behavior? And I think one of the key things is not using measures and KPIs to blame people, but understand how we can get better. So you're ahead of the game and understand what do we learn from this and how can we continually get better. And if you're aware of a potential problem coming along, you can get more resources and more support to help to address that problem before it becomes an issue. That's the key point. Obviously, the other thing about objectives and KPIs is we have another question here. Do you have SMART objectives and KPIs? We're going to put the poll up now. Can you please answer that poll based on on what you do in your company at the moment? Okay. Okay. I'm pleased someone has them. Well, you can see the score. Okay. That's obviously the reason why you're on this webinar. You're working at it, and you're quite right. I was running a training program, and people are working at it, and they struggle with objectives and KPIs and defining them. I'm pleased that someone has them, and just getting an objective or a KPI specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound is really critically important. And people do struggle with that, and it's something that you wouldn't. You've really got to take time to do this. And what I will say, and I've got a lot of experience and I run a lot of training programs with this, is it gets easier the more you do it. Start defining objectives, you start defining KPIs, you get people to challenge it, you get people to question it, and it gets stronger. It becomes more specific, it becomes more measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. You've really got to use that. And if you question yourself on all the objectives and KPIs, you will get there. Okay. Can we move on? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So one of the things about setting objectives, really you've got to clarify whatever level, strategic or department, what do you want to achieve? And they've got to be clear and established at corporate and department levels. And then when you've got to identify objectives, and this applies whether it's a corporate, department, or individual, you've got to take time to do it. What I see when I was in a corporate role and we go through exercises, particularly we spend a lot of time on the strategy and maybe some time on the department ones. But when it came to individuals, they quickly rushed them. Let's get that off. I can't be bothered with it. You do need time to reflect. You need to be looking for causal links to say, how are these objectives delivering to the department objectives, to the divisional objectives, to the corporate objectives? And that's where you need to test it. Because often I find that managers have their view on what their department should be doing, but they don't relate it back to what the corporate or divisional, or however you set up objectives are. I think that's absolutely critical. You should also limit them, limit the number of objectives at a department or individual level. So 2 to 3 normally related to projects you're working on or key department deliverables. 1 or 2 then should be on new initiatives or new projects or work that will stretch the department as a whole. I think these are important because you want to encourage everyone to stretch. What you don't want is objectives that are just replicating what the department does, because you're not going to get performance that way. If you look at yourself as an athlete, you're always looking to improve. A sportsman's always looking to get better. So you've got to do something to stretch the department and stretch yourself. That's absolutely critical. And sometimes I see objectives that are just about our day-to-day job. And then finally, use the SMART test. Are they specific? Are they measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound? I think that's critical. Here's some tips I've found is don't use an objective as a task as an input. Typically you see it more with performance objectives and KPIs. They just replicate what's in the job description or certain things you have to do in the department. I think what you've got to do is look at what the objective is in terms of what you want to achieve. So what do you want to achieve as a department? Define that as an objective. Look at an individual. What do they want to achieve and what and what therefore they should be doing. I think to the other thing, establish your objective, and here's some tests. Define, when you're establishing the objective and you have it written down, here's something that's a very good tip. Ask yourself, what is the outcome of that objective? And write down what you've said the outcome is, and then reframe the objective based on the outcome. It will change your perspective, because the reason you have objectives, the reason you have KPIs, you want to deliver something. There has to be an outcome to that. So I think that's something that you should be aiming for. And if it's the same as the objective, great, you're there. But if not, reframe as I said about the outcome. Challenge the objective. Why are you doing this? What's it actually doing? Where is this taking me? Because if you've got good objectives, you'll get good KPIs. So are they delivering the corporate objectives? Can you see an audit trail? Can you link this back from what your individual objectives to department, to division, corporate, or whatever? Create that audit trail, then you'll check what you're doing, and then test it by sharing with colleagues. Now move to KPIs. KPIs are the key activities that you or the department must be doing to achieve the objective, and and what's the measure on what you have to do to make sure you're going to achieve the objective. So it's two things. What do you need to be doing, and what's the measure of what you're doing, target, percentage, whatever, to achieve the KPIs. So define what you need to measure, okay, and then what are the key performance indicators? Some people might say, okay, I've got this project, I've got 10 or 12 different things to do. Do I put them all as KPIs? No. What you need to identify are those 10 or 12 things you've got to do. What are the key? The causal links, you've got to say what's absolutely key for me to complete and deliver to go to the next stage of what I want to achieve. Because some things you can let slip, but some things you can't. If you let them slip in terms of number, in terms of dates, in terms of percentage, you will not achieve your objective. And don't put indicators there that are nice to have. That's particularly important when you get down to individual objectives. People agree, or KPIs, and people agree to them because they're easy to get, and we always like to go for the easy ones. That's our nature. Limit the KPIs to obviously 2 to 3 per objective, but make them very specific. This is absolutely critical. An objective can be more higher level, outlining what you're doing with maybe a target in that, and that's no problem. But the KPIs have to be very specific with timescales, and often a target as well. Okay, so the target could be numeric or percentage, and then review progress on a monthly basis. Now, by the way, just when I said the target is ideally numeric and percentage, you may not, particularly in some of the areas that don't have a numerical percentage, but at least you'll have a time scale. And then when you're measuring yourself on the monthly basis, you will say, okay, I've completed 20% by this month. If you've got to achieve 100%, let's say by December, and it's now September, and you've only completed 20%, there's a good chance you might not be able to achieve that objective. That's the other way of doing it. So ideally have a numerical percentage target, if not a time scale. The key thing of key performance indicators is there has to be an action section. What do you do? What do you do to get back on track? What do you do if things are really slipping? If you don't have an action section, it's a waste of time. All you're doing is measuring, and so what? What's that telling you? The whole thing of setting clear objectives and KPIs is there has to be an action. And that needs to be defined, and define who does what, where, and when. Okay? And then carry out a reality check to make sure they'll achieve. Once you've done it, step back. And what I've said to people is, often when you've defined your objectives and KPIs at whatever level, leave it, walk away from it for at least 24 hours. Then go back with a clear head and go through that reality check, go through that audit trail. Is what I'm doing as a department going to deliver as a division, as a corporate, whatever, and get the logic behind that. So if you had to defend that in front of the board or in front of the senior management, you have that logic. Same for the KPIs. Are the KPIs the key activities that I need to do that need to be measured to ensure I deliver that objective? And again, I mean, let's ask another question here. We're just going to put another poll up there. Who's responsible for driving the implementation of objectives and KPIs? Could you just take a minute to vote on that one? We're limited on the number of options we have, but could you vote on that, please? There's still a few of you needed to vote. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the majority is down to the functional managers to do that. The big question is, have you got clarity over the corporate strategy and objectives to be able to develop your objectives and KPIs? I think that's the big question. Certainly many of the companies I go to, they don't have that clarity. So for me, it's a cascading problem. So the CEOs and MDs need to identify that at a level and get involved in helping the functional managers define those. But often, it's left to HR to do it, and that is a failure. If you left to HR because it's driven by the performance appraisal and things like that, it's failed. It really is down to the functional managers, but also I think more needs to be done by the CEO and the MD. Okay, KPIs must have a target. Ideally, if it's a timeline, if it's a numerical percentages, and it can be an absolute amount, a percentage, and they should be defined sort of relative to internal benchmarks. So you might want to surpass last year, or relative to external, you want to surpass your competitor and become #1 in a particular market compared to a competitor, or relative to global best practice, particularly on such things where you have standards in the oil industry or whatever, or you want load factors in the airline industry. You can use that as well. Could I ask the final poll? Is it the final poll? How many individual objectives or KPIs do you work off yourself, either at a department or individual level? Could you just take a 30 seconds to a minute to vote on that? Okay. Actually, that's reassuring. That's reassuring. The one person needs a bit of help. Hopefully you'll get something from this, but typically it's 3 to 5, and I would go for closer to 3 than to 5. I think the whole thing is about focus. It's interesting enough, if you look at if you fly a plane, you see the dashboard of a plane. It's full of all measures, but actually you only need 2 or 3 things to fly that plane. You need lift, thrust, and I can't remember what the other one is. So it's all about focus. So I'm pleased that many of you have got a small number of objectives for KPIs. Okay. Finally, what are the right KPIs? Is it going to deliver the objectives? So are the KPIs, can we measure them to make sure we're going to deliver the objectives? Can it answer specific questions or important unanswered questions that will help the business to achieve that objective? Can it help you to make a decision? Because they've got to be there to make a decision. Do you have the data, or is data collection easy? Because there's no use giving yourself a KPI that you want to measure and it's difficult to get hold of the data. That's critical. Do you have the right quality of data? Particularly if you're reporting this on a monthly basis, it puts a lot of pressure on people to get the measures, to get the updates on where they are. That is a problem and an issue, and often you need a dedicated business intelligence team or a dedicated person to make sure everyone delivers the data on their objectives and KPIs. Does the data answer the key performance questions? If it doesn't, you haven't got them right. And obviously, as I said, can it help you to make decisions? Is the target of KPI too easy? One of the issues is if it's too easy, a lot of people like that. They tend to go for it's like water finding its level. They tend to find that very quickly. Another cost and effort justified. I've seen people set up business intelligence units, spend a lot of money on software. Someone told me they spent $350,000 on a business intelligence software and it's not delivering what they want. So again, whilst it's important, you've really got to see if you're getting value for money there. Okay, typically also when you do the measure, particularly on the reporting, you use the traffic signals. Red, Houston, we have a major problem. Amber, there's some concern you might not meet it and should be monitored. And green means everything's on target. It's very simple, it's very visual. And also I do believe that a lot of these particular department objectives and KPIs, do you actually put them up on the wall in your department so people can see them? If you want to get performance measurement down the organization, make it visual at all levels. It is simple. The problem is a lot of objectives and KPIs are kept in managers' drawers and they're in your laptops or whatever, and people see them as something separate to their day job. Make it visual. Take a leaf out of the book of production management. Make it visual, show progress, have regular meetings on it, and I think that's essential. Setting objectives and the objectives and KPIs for individuals, very similar, but I think on the objectives and KPIs, People tend to replicate what's in their job, but what I tend to say is, okay, what's critical parts of their job that have to be delivered? So identify those, and then one or two that's going to stretch the person beyond their job or develop their competencies or skills beyond what it is at the moment. So that's always a good guide to sort of look at. Do not replicate a job description. It's no value to anyone, okay? Particularly you if you're looking after the people. Then good feedback's an important one. You know, you've got to give feedback. How we're progressing against the objectives. If an objective is amber or red, let's not point fingers. Let's understand what sort of support and help the individual is going to be needing. Be factual and specific, but be constructive. What have we learned from this? How can we improve things better? Agree what's needs to be done and address. When I worked for Anderson, one of the things we used to do when we finished the projects, we'd all get into the meeting room. Everyone was told to leave their baggage outside. And we'd say, right, what worked on the project? Let's celebrate that. Let's continue doing that. What didn't work? Okay, we're not blaming people here, but what do we need to learn collectively and individually that we take to the next project? And follow up with you, ensure the employees addressing those issues. So ultimately, that was a quick rush through what is a longer program that I run on KPI selection and management. And actually, to be perfectly honest, when I run the programs, the people do all the work. We work on defining everything from corporate objectives and KPIs to department objectives and KPIs to individual objectives and KPIs. And then they can step away from it on the wall, and they can see how it all builds up into that pyramid that actually starts building from the top. So ultimately, I think, you know, I'm a big fan of the balanced scorecard. I'm a big fan of measurement, providing it's right. And, you know, Peter Drucker's quote is right: if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Okay. I hope I've answered some questions there. If you've got any if there's got questions that you'd like to ask, can you please record them now on the chat? Question box, yeah. Yeah, have you got any questions for us? Please type them in the question box. Don't let me get away that easily. I'm sure there must be questions there, because I summarize a lot of things very, very quickly. Okay, I got a question here from Raju. How many KPIs should a balanced scorecard have? Okay, I said I'm a big fan of the balanced scorecard, but one of its biggest problems is too many measures. If you're using the 4-box, and I've worked on this before, and I have seen companies with thousands of measures, and suddenly you lose sight of what you're actually doing. So that is the drawback. So you've got to be focused on that. Typically, you would say, when I've used the balanced scorecard, if you're using the 4-box, I would say 1 or 2 objectives in each box. And then obviously the measures and the targets against those, the KPIs against those. So it isn't by the number of employees, it's about what are the key targets that you need to be addressing in your business, whether you have 10 employees or 10,000 employees. It's about the business. So, but Raju, the difficult thing is focus and keeping it down to the key performance indicators and the key and the key objectives. That's a challenge. If you're unable to get the Kian, I think I'm pronouncing your name right. If you can't get the data, how can you measure it? Don't take it as a measure. And then you need to, as I said, what's the cost of getting that data? How much time will it take to get that data? And this you've got to be careful of. I have worked in organizations, in fact my last company, where some of the data took a lot of effort to get to it, and that put a lot of pressure on people. And ultimately, we went back and said, is this absolutely critical? So there's no harm in going back and saying, well, we're struggling to get this data. Is it critical? But also, it highlighted in some way, yes, we do need this data. So that was able to go back, and we actually then started to say what activities and what do we need to do to get that data. Is there a limit on a number of key limit on a number of key measures? Yes, for example, as I said, you've got, I would say for key performance 1 to 3. And what are the key measures that you need to do that? What are the key things that you need to measure? And that's the challenge, and that's the reason it's an iterative process. And when I do the training, people struggle to start with, but then they get better. But you know what? When they go back and look at it again, they get even better. So you're not going to get it right the first time. You won't even get it right the second time, but the third and the fourth time, that's when it'll start to get better. You'll get it more focused. Fawaz, you've asked a question. Any examples? Yeah. Fawaz, can I ask you I'll ask you another question. Can you give me an objective or a KPI that you want to, an area that you'd like the KPIs defined for? Then I'll be able to do it. So I throw that question back to you. Is there a particular objective that you're looking at and you want to define the KPIs? I'll come back to you on that. Herline, how do you challenge managers who allow their subordinates with easy targets? Okay. I think this is where you look back at the audit trail. Is what the individual's trying to do here, is that going to deliver on the department objectives, corporate objectives? If you've got that audit trail, this is not really stretching the person. If it's an easy task, is this going to stretch the person? If they're doing it already, so one of the, give person a target of saying process X number of documents a day. Well, if they're already doing that, that's not going to stretch them. And also, you need to test. Someone asked me, there's a guy who processes all these documents for visas. He says he does it day in, day out, week in, week out. What else can I give him? And part of it is saying, okay, what you could say to him is you've got to come up with 2 ideas to improve the speed of the process that you do, or simplify the process, or reduce the process. So get them to think beyond just doing to thinking how they can improve their particular job. So that would be an example. So yes, I think you've got to challenge the managers. Please challenge them, because at the end of the day, if people are getting away with easy targets, that manager is going to struggle to achieve his objectives. Reem, hang on a minute. And does it have to be aligned with your balanced scorecard? If you're going to use it, yes, it's got to be aligned. There's got to be a logical flow. You've got to see that audit trail. That will help. And I had a question, what is type? Oh, well, okay, there are types of KPIs. Sorry, Reem again. There's output KPIs, such as producing X number of widgets. There's input KPIs. So if you're doing research and development, you've got to be able to get some information and some data before you can do it. There's lagging KPIs, which are related to financials often. There's customer satisfaction KPIs, where you do customer satisfaction or employee satisfaction surveys. So there are quite a number of types of KPIs. I've just gone through a few of them there. Sultan, in your opinion, which department should be responsible for monitoring companies' KPIs? For the bigger organizations, they often have a performance measurement and management department that acts as the facilitator for KPIs. But these companies have the whole balanced scorecard and elements of that, and people are responsible for driving it because it's big. There's lots of objectives, KPIs, lots of levels. So what they need to do is have that. If you have a smaller organization, for example, my last organization, ART, was about 3,500 people, and we had a senior management team of which I was involved. It was the board. We had about 9 people, and we used to have regular monthly meetings around the balanced scorecard. But we had other people, mainly within the finance and HR side, making sure that all the data was pulled together. So often you'd need to pull 2 or 3 people together to pull in the data to make sure it's available. But also each director and manager were responsible to making sure that data was delivered in time to populate the scorecard, populate the KPIs, so they could have the meetings. Fawaz, do you have any templates to do the right KPIs? The templates that I have are about recording the KPIs. What are the objectives then? What are the key performance cases? What are the measures? What are the targets? Who's got to be delivered? So yes, there's plenty of those around. I have a bunch myself that I've used, and there are people, you can find many on the, on the internet. Okay, Saad, is KPI part of quality management system and business? Definitely. It's used in both areas, both quality and business improvement. Key performance indicators about saying, are we delivering what we're supposed to be delivering? Are we delivering on time to the numbers and qualities that we want? And therefore, that is critical. And particularly with business improvement, they have KPIs. And if you've got a business improvement or business intelligence department, that'll be their, you talk KPIs and you're talking their language. Next question, to start with setting up the KPI, do we have to choose one of the frameworks which you discussed earlier? Not necessarily. I don't believe so. I think you've got to say, it's quite simple. What are your strategic objectives? And what are strategic KPIs? And then one of those strategic KPIs can become a division or department objective, right? And then you develop department KPIs on that, for example. But actually a department KPI can become an individual person or a section leader's objective, and then KPIs. So it's about building it up. I come back to the analogy of the pyramid. You can use the frameworks, they are useful. So yes, I'd encourage looking at them. As I said, I'm a big fan of the balanced scorecard because that's where KPIs came from. KPIs, measures and targets came from the balanced scorecard. Okay, Fawaz, which is better, KPIs or scorecard? Scorecard need KPIs because a KPI is a measure, it's a score of how you're doing at every particular point. So a KPI is part of a scorecard. They're not separate. Is it compulsory to have a KPI for all organizations? If you want to achieve your objectives, because if you give someone objectives, often they're vague, maybe they're not very clear, and people have all sorts of reasons for not delivering it. If you have KPIs, they know that they've got to carry out certain activities by a certain time or a certain number to ensure they achieve the objectives. So yes, I would encourage to do that. I'm a big fan of it. That's the reason I'm talking about it. I'm passionate about it, and I think yes, if you're going to have objectives, you've got to have KPIs as well. Any more questions? Okay, got a long one here. Is there a good reference that we can get examples for customer service KPIs? Because I work in a government authority and we follow, and what we follow is not covering our department. Yeah, if you look on the internet, there are lots of guides on KPIs, particularly on customer service. It's such things as response time, time to completion, customer satisfaction, closing of queries, how long it takes to close, quick to response. There's a whole bunch of them there. And actually, Reem, a lot of people say to me, what's best practice? It's what's right for your department. If you work with some of your people and say, what are the key measures that we need to be doing to have excellent customer service? And get people to think as a customer and what you would want, you could develop your own KPIs, but there are a number of standard ones on there. If you search on the internet, there are many. And obviously, if you're interested in this, I run a KPI selection and management course here at Informa. It's a 3-day program and it's very practical. People come away with corporate, department and individual objectives and KPIs. So if you want to consider that, it's very useful. Okay, will you be sharing the handouts? I think they're available. Yes, you will get them. Yes. Can she use KPI results in individual department? I see no reason why you can't take department objectives and KPIs and move them into individual objectives and KPIs. I think it helps everyone. particularly if the employee is quite clear about what they've got to deliver, and particularly when you've got to give feedback and you've got clear key performance indicators with measures there, it's very difficult to say, shoo, Yanni, I wasn't able to do it. And particularly if you're monitoring it on a regular basis every month, there should be no surprises there. Research and study, if I was research and studies, okay, I think you're writing at the moment. I think ultimately, what's your output from the research and studies? What have you got to achieve in your research and studies department? What do you have to deliver? What are the outputs? Okay, and then within that, you'll start defining those. So that might be carrying out X number of research, X number of investigations. So therefore, you'll say, okay, that will mean then you'll need to assign that to what key performance indicators. So I'll need to have done desk research by such and such a date. I will need to have carried out surveys by such and such a date. I will need to have spoken to, if it's research, X number of institutions by such and such a date. So these would be, I've got very little information here, sort of examples of what you would do for both objectives and KPIs. So what do you need to do on a research project or a study? And then give yourself the measures in terms of the key tasks you've got to complete and measure yourself against so you deliver that in the timescales. Okay, one final question here. I think we'll have to, can we do a soft topic for study review? You can get access to the soft copy? Yeah, I think you can gain access to the soft copy. In fairness, this is just a summary of a lot of work I've done, so I've given you a very much high level. It was supposed to be a 40-minute presentation, but there is a lot of interest in this area, and certainly have a look at Informa and the work we do there. It is critically important, and what you could do is put some of your people on a course here and then take that back and do it within your own department or your own company. But I think more and more companies do it, and it always surprises me how little people do on effective, smart objectives and KPIs, and then actually measure them on a regular basis. Any more questions? Okay, I think we'll need to finish it for now. Thank you for your participation and all the people who stayed on this. I hope you've got something different from it. Go away and do something different with that, and I wish you all individually the best of luck.